Welcome back, everybody, to Talk of the Now podcast, our theology edition that we do. And we've got Joe back. Joe, how are you?
Yeah, good. How are you, Gene?
I said hey to you already, but I'm saying to you hey officially as we start
Yeah.
the podcast.
hmm
Um, Joe, I had not realized how long it had been since I had you on until I looked up our old podcast. And it appears that you came on over a year ago last time.
hmm I
And
don't.
I thought I had you
I
on
don't
earlier.
remember. Yeah.
Our last our last episode was November 1st of 2023.
Okay.
And it would have been earlier than that, but it was
hmm
posted on November 1st of 2023.
hmm
Um, and that was our third installment of our Bible series. So if somebody's been on pins and needles waiting for the next one, I hope that they haven't.
Yeah.
eh,
Yeah.
Uh,
They've wasted a lot of time.
they've had plenty of time to wait for it, that's for sure.
uh Yeah.
Hopefully, our next one will not be a year out. Um, maybe. Uh,
hmm
but anyway, I did look at it, and the last time we had met, um, we were looking at the Old Testament still, and we got up to the major and minor prophets. Um, so
hmm
what we'll do is we'll carry on from there, and the minor prophets end at where?
Minor prophets end. I guess you could call it Malachi.
Yeah, I guess that would be, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, did we? I didn't go back and listen to all of our episodes again. Did we skip the? I guess you would call them poetry and so forth.
Oh, I don't.
Proverbs.
Possibly. Yeah.
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 I couldn't remember if we had gone through the Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Psalms, and I don't think that we did. That I best remember.
Yeah. No, I don't think so.
So I think that would probably be good for us to hit on that before we get to the New Testament.
Okay.
And maybe I had a few other questions about the period between Old Testament and New Testament,
Sure. Yeah.
which I think, especially for me for years, was sort of a mystery. Like what even happened during that period. So I don't think that we hit Job either, but maybe if you will, maybe just kind of talk a little bit about what we won't spend a lot of time in Job. I think most people know the story of Job, but maybe just talk a little about what Job was like and why or how that leads us into. I mean, I know they're not written at the same time, but how that leads us into the Psalms.
Well, yeah, the reason why Job leads us into the Psalms is because it's a book of poetry, right? So
Mm-hmm.
just fits that category, and that's just how the Bible is set up, really. The Old Testament set up, and I mean the New Testament too, but since it fits the category of poetry, I guess you can kind of throw Jonah in there as possibly a poetry book, Lamentations, but those are also prophecy, written by prophets.
Right.
Uh, Job supposedly is the oldest book in the Bible, written before Genesis, at least chronologically. Um, what is Job like? What is the book Job like, or what is Job the person like? I guess what.
Maybe both.
So yeah, I guess I can start with the person. I mean, Job, he says he's a righteous man, and
Mm-hmm.
has 10 children, has a wife, is very successful, and as that starts off, the second verse of Job 1 there, he possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, very many servants. So he was kind of like, possibly even greater than Abraham, or up to that level as far as riches go.
Very well to do.
Yeah. So, and he had it going on, and then we sort of get a behind the scenes view of God and Satan talking about Job, and it makes me wonder Have they talked about me? Have they talked about you, Gene? Um,
Did the topic ever come up?
yeah. So Job, Satan, I suppose, is threatened by Job somewhat and threatened more by God. And he says, well, the only reason why Job serves you is because you've been good to him, and take all these things away and see what happens. And God says, all right, well, let's do that and take everything away from him except for his health. I mean, except for his life, keep his life, take everything else away, except for his wife as well. So, that's his wife is left after all his children die and all his possessions are gone, and his wife says, "Curse God and die," and he doesn't do that. And the famous quote there, "The Lord gave and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And so, yeah, the rest of the book is basically, Job dealing with himself, Job dealing with his friends, and then finally Job dealing with God, or God dealing with Job. And Job is kind of like, why has this happened to me? And God answers him, and he says, because I'm God, and I do what I will. And where were you when I created everything? So it's kind of a picture into when people struggle and they kind of look out to God and they say, what's happening? Why has this happened to me? And a lot of times God doesn't give us answers, right? So, but God is merciful to Job, and he restores his possessions, and he restores his children, and I think he restores it tenfold, and then his children, all of them are the ones that he lost are all born to him as well. So it ends well, but still we have that question: why does man suffer?
Right.
And
yeah,
I guess you could ask that question: why does man suffer?
Well, I think they're looking at it. It's both historical and educational, like as it relates to each person. I've never, I don't know that I've ever sat down and put myself in Job. Well, maybe a little bit put myself in Job's position, but hard to based on what he went through. But I remember in college I was at a summer beach project, as we called them, parachurch organization. And I believe one of the people played a sermon that a pastor gave where he talked about Job's sin. Have you ever heard about this before? And that was an interesting take.
Sounds like one of Job's friends.
He basically went on to talk about how I believe he said that Job's sin was that he was well, like that he was well off, if you will, like he had everything, and but couldn't see all that was going on around him, type thing. And it kind of used it to like illustrate how you know suburbanites can be well off but don't see the crud going on around them with homelessness, or people that are in bad situations or scenarios and just kind of go over the highways and byways to their fancy offices and that kind of thing. I mean, the point he was making wasn't a bad point, that a lot of times we are well and don't take care of or look to our neighbor, I guess you will, to take care of love our neighbor as ourselves, if you will. But I don't know that if he was totally accurate about trying to say that was Job's, sin per se.
Yeah, well, God didn't charge Job any wrong.
Yeah.
It's not wrong to have many possessions, and
Hmm.
it's not wrong to be successful. It's not sinful in any way. Um, but what is your attitude towards those things? Are they idols in your life? I don't think that's the case for Job. I think that's what Satan was trying to convince God of and convince Job of in a certain sense. But you know and so he gives him the test. Let's see if we take it away,
Hmm.
and see if God is really worshiping God, or Job is really worshiping God because he has these things.
Right.
And that's not the case. Job says, "Blessed be the name of the Lord." And then at other times it says, "Though he slay me, yet I will serve him." Of course, there is some complaining in there. Why is this happening to me? I don't know why this is happening to me. And his friend's like, "Well, you must have done something,
Mm.
right?" And that happens in life in general too. Well, I got sick, or I lost my job, or something tragic happened. I remember in 9/11 happened, and Pat Robertson tried to explain that. Well,
Oh
it's
yes.
it's because of the homosexuality in America. That's why 9/11 happened. And that's ridiculous. I mean, there's
Cherry
other
picking.
yeah, there's other uh consequences to homosexuality. I can maybe you could pick on a disease like AIDS or something like that, or you know um sexual transmitted diseases. Yeah, that would be a one-to-one correlation. But
Right.
it's kind of like it's kind of like in John chapter 9, when the man who's born blind, and the people around us saying, was it because of this man's sin, or his parents? And Jesus says neither, but it was because of the glory, for the glory of God to be shown in him. So whenever a tragedy happens, I don't think you can ever say, "Oh, this is why,"
Hmm.
you know, because we really don't even get the answer in Job as to why.
Yeah. Well,
Um, yeah,
and I also with the 9/11 thing, I mean, it would be easy, it's easy to Monday morning quarterback and say, well, God's punishing us. You wouldn't have to say even that. You could just say for for the sin of America, for whatever it may be. Maybe you may say, oh, we're getting our just dues for having slavery. We're getting our just dues for, you know, all like you said, all the sexual immorality or the bad things that people do. I mean, but what about all the good things you do? You know what I mean? It's like, I mean, you could take it at a macro level or micro level. To your point.
and I would say the reason why something like 9/11 happens, or something like what's the Middle East conflict right now, October
Hmm.
6th or 7th, whenever that happened, is because there's evil in the world,
Right.
and evil is perpetrated.
Sinful fallen world.
Yeah, and evil people do evil things. Um, and
Hmm.
God allows that. God ordains that, for His good purposes.
Hmm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Well, moving on to Psalms, unless you had anything else on Job. Uh, the Psalms are probably familiar with most people if you've even been close to the church or, you know, attended church services at some point, I guess. But I guess if you could kind of first off, I guess, go into what is the Psalms? What is Psalms and why was it written and who was it written by?
Yeah, so the Psalms, I mean, some people have described it, I think rightly so, a God's hymn book. It's right in the middle of the Bible. It's a collection of songs, psalms. So that's really what that means. They're meant to be sung.
Mm-hmm.
And there's five books, if you will, that they're collection of songs. It's written. I mean, you can make the case that it's written over thousands of years. I guess you can make the case of that because Moses writes one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Psalm 90. David, he writes most of them. The sons of Korah, which are different than the sons of Korah that we read about in Genesis or in the Pentateuch. The Solomon writes some. Asaph. Yeah, there's a number of different writers. I would say David is the top one or the most well-known writer there.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, they're written for God's people to sing. That's basically why they were written.
Mm-hmm. By different authors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. And is my memory holding up? Is it Psalm 19 that's one of the most famous ones? Or is it 119?
Well, 19 and 119 are good.
I just thought having a brain thing here.
119 is the longest psalm. I think that's 176
okay.
verses. So that's an interesting one.
I think I'm thinking of the I waited patiently for the Lord.
Yeah, that's.
He inclined to hear my cry. Is that 40?
Yeah. Well, it says that a few times.
Oh, okay.
So but the one that you're probably referring to, Psalm 119.
Okay.
It's bigger than most books of the Bible, 176 verses.
Yeah.
That one's interesting because it's a little alphabet tool. So for Hebrew children at the time. So how would you learn your alphabet? You would learn it by Psalm 119. So that's why at the top of their first verse you have.
I didn't know that.
Aleph, and then verse 9 Bet, and then Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zion. So I just know those because I got the Hebrew letters, but they're all in order, just like you learn your ABCs.
Right.
So each section would start with that letter in Hebrew, and you learn it, and then sing it. It's just like we say, sing our ABCs. So that's basically it. So it's not just singing. There you go. There's other things. There's prophecy. Jesus says all the Psalms were written about me, and I would say that's the case. Maybe not every sentence, but every Psalm you can make the case that Jesus is there either directly or indirectly. So
that's a good point. Do you? I know that people like to say, "What's your favorite verses or whatever?" Do you have any favorite psalm verses or chapters that you're a fan of?
It's kind of like my favorite. Like if you were to ask my favorite songs in general, I mean they kind of change from my reading, but probably everybody's favorite psalm is Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And that's, even secular and atheists know that psalm. What I usually do with the psalms.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. What I usually do with the psalms is I pick out what's today, the 20th. So I go Psalm 20, Psalm 50, Psalm 80, Psalm 110, Psalm 140, and just so you pick out 5. It usually works out to 5. And then you've read quite a bit for that day. I can't say that I do that every single day, but I at times have done that every single day. I should get back on that.
Well, I'll confess that I haven't read Psalms all the way through before, so I'm a little behind.
That's the easiest way to do it. If you want to read the Psalms, in a month, You read five at a time there.
Mm-hmm.
Add 30 to each one.
Speaking of my own personal goals, right now I've been trying to read through the entire Old Testament, and I'm currently hovering around Leviticus 8 or Leviticus 9. So
Well, that's usually the part.
we're going to keep marching.
Get bogged down. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's tough to get through. Yep.
But it is good though. It's educational for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So after Psalms comes Proverbs, and what's the difference, and what is Proverbs about?
Well, the difference is they're not. Well, some of them can be sung, I guess, in Proverbs, but they're more just wisdom literature.
Mm-hmm.
Written mostly, I think, almost exclusively by Solomon. So, Solomon asks, God asks, what do you want? If you were to ask me of anything, and Solomon asked for wisdom, and he gets it from God, and so I think that's the answer to his prayer there, in the writing of Proverbs, and also Ecclesiastes. But yeah, Proverbs, the first Bible I was ever given, my parents gave it to me. I think it was 9 years old. So, and in the front of that Bible, it said Proverbs 1:7. Says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. So that's a good place to start if you don't know anything about God or the Bible. Start there in Proverbs 1:7, where you start at the beginning. What is the fear of the Lord? Well, that at least starts with acknowledging that God exists, rather than trying to explain him away, right? So, and then secondly, you take him on his terms, right? And so, test me, God, and teach me your ways. And fools despise wisdom and instruction. And we see that everywhere in the classroom, and in the workplace, and at my daughter's basketball practice an hour ago. If you don't listen to instruction, you're not going to do well. So,
and I think that I think that, golly, even if you're just somebody that doesn't even care about the Bible and you read Proverbs, you will gain wisdom.
Yeah, you will. I mean, and the other thing about Proverbs, I mean, it is the word of God, but it is not necessarily about salvation per se. There are definitely salvation verses, so to speak. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your path. So you can make a case that that's a salvation, and you can make a case that it's not. But Proverbs are basically wisdom literature, and
it's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
Well, I also think that, like, for those that haven't even looked at Proverbs before, it's just chock full of that very thing. Like, if you could do the old roulette finger thing and just like put your finger on it, like I'm doing it now, it says, the heart of the righteous weighs its answers. It's like, if you've ever, or another one, the tongue that brings healing is a tree of life. But a deceitful tongue crushes the spirit. That's from 15:3. Like, if you've ever wanted to know what is the inner workings of God's universe when it comes to fundamentals of how, how understanding works, and how how to conduct your life in a way by God's design, you almost won't find a better place in some ways. Just, it does everything. We're talking about a cheerful heart to greediness to, you know, how to treat your kids and all that kind of stuff.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, you can play that game with Proverbs and not go wrong. Um,
Yeah.
it talks about um, Proverbs 31. We often hear about if you're a single guy in the church, oh, find the Proverbs 31 woman, and
Yeah.
well, in order to find one of those, you at least should read Proverbs 31 and see what it says.
Right.
um, so, um, you know, um, I often quote that um, and, and use it in my prayers and thanking God for my own wife and an
Hmm.
excellent wife who can find. She is far more precious than jewels. And that is true. If you've been married for any length of time, um, our wives make us better men. So
Hmm.
that's charm is deceitful, beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. So if you're a
Yeah.
single guy out there, that's the kind of woman you should be looking
I
for.
definitely think it's when my kids get to be middle school or high school age, like that 15-year-old range. I wish I'd done it more when I was 15, but there's so much of that in here. Like I just came across one that says like in his heart man plans his course, but the Lord determines his steps.
Hmm.
I mean, that's the formula. you know, because as when you're growing up and sometimes we forget it that, well, I've got to figure these things out but, the Bible is telling you, you know, um, it's okay to make your plans, but realize there's a bigger authority in the background that's actually, making things happen.
Yeah, another one like that. Proverbs 27, do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring. So I
Hmm.
remember talking about that verse. I don't know why we were talking about it. We were driving home, me and my wife, Ashley, from Jacksonville, where my sisters live down there. And I was talking about, you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And I think it's because I think I was in seminary. I was going to preach on that verse you know and as I was preaching on that verse, my wife was also getting in a car accident and broke her leg.
Mm.
So I said, well, that verse came true, and thankfully it wasn't worse than that.
Yeah.
I've always read that verse and remember that time, because and then yeah, I'm not boasting about tomorrow. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow.
Hmm.
You really don't.
Yeah. I when it comes to that philosophy, I often tell people that somebody says, well, how do you look at it, Gene? For instance, like there's always that God's will versus my, you know, effort, or however you want to say it.
Hmm.
A lot of times I tell them, well, it's sort of like providence, or it's sort of like, if they even have an understanding of the concept of just trying to remember, election. Thank you. Like there's two sides to this coin. One side that I cannot see and know anything about. And then there's the other side of it that says, well, what does God tell me what to do? And what does God's word say that I should do or think, or how I should think? So if I say to myself, well, something, let's just use a common thing. If I want a wife, I know if I'm a semi smart Christian that God will provide, right? Okay. Does that mean that I sit in my bedroom and wait for her to fall through the ceiling onto my lap?
Right.
No. There's also, verses after verses of even Jesus talking about building a firm foundation and finding, well, what does that look like? That means that, you have to actually go out there and live your life, and you do the things that might, you know, asking girls out, meeting girls, things like that. That still has to be done in order to get to that point where, for instance, I know you met your wife randomly at a Waffle House.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
if you weren't looking for the wife, if you were just like, well, it's just going to happen, in a way that, in a sense, that is what happened. But in another sense, you were looking.
Well, and that was I wasn't doing the right thing, and God overrules, right?
Oh,
So,
I didn't know that.
yeah, I mean, it was late at night, and she wasn't doing the right thing either. God overruled. So there's yeah, God determines our steps.
Mm,
And I'm not saying, go out and do whatever you want.
right.
Do the right things, do what God tells you to do. But that doesn't mean that everything is going to go exactly the way that you want it to go. I mean,
Mm,
hardly ever does that happen any day, really. If you think about it, it's like, I'm going to do this in the morning and this in the afternoon. And oftentimes, something will happen. I mean, because we live in a fallen world. Things happen. Kids get sick. We get sick. Somebody doesn't show up. The electricity goes out.
Lose your job.
What fill in the blank. Um, all kinds of possibilities can happen, and yet God is orchestrating all of those things for His good purposes,
Mm,
and for our blessings as well.
yeah.
They might not feel like blessings or look like blessings right away,
Hmm.
but because they're from God, they are.
I'm reading. This brings me to a point real quick. Before we move on and wrap it up, I'm reading a book right now called "On the Other Hand." It's by a girl that I went to high school with named Jessica Lane, and she was in a car accident at age 16 and has been paralyzed since that time. It's happening to her in the early 90s, and it's a fascinating book. Woman of faith. Um, she talks about her struggles, her mindsets, all this stuff, and even talks about how she's dealt with it, and uses a lot of biblical references in the book. I hadn't quite finished the book yet, but it is a fascinating read to get her perspective on things in life, and how it relates to the word, because she uses the word a lot um, in the book, and how it's impacted her and what she's felt about it and that kind of thing. For instance, just how I don't know. She's like for one thing, she feels like she feels that God can heal her, and I think that that's very true. And she talks about her thoughts of how the hows and whys it happened to her and that kind of thing, and just kind of goes into she made the last chapter, for instance, that I read was about her, how it's taught her to wait for God and His timing, so to speak. And it's pretty powerful when you think about, someone like who's waiting. I don't know that she'll be healed in this lifetime or the next when she goes to heaven, but having that mindset of waiting on God for whatever it is that you believe He has in His will for you is just pretty amazing to think about.
Yeah, I was thinking about that just the other day about when people pray for healing, it might not come
Mhm.
on this side of heaven, but surely it will come in heaven. So it's not that God hasn't answered that prayer. He just hasn't answered that prayer in the timing that you want it or in the circumstance that you want it.
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, it'll be, even greater. I mean, I thought about this where the Apostle Paul, who, when he's in prison, waiting his decapitation, his sure death, and that is how he dies. And yet, at the end of his life, he's writing to Second Timothy, and he says, "There is a crown that awaits for me."
Hmm.
It's like, well, how can you have a crown if you don't have a head? but
Yeah.
his faith is so sure that he says, "Well, God's going to put my head back on."
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting how that work. I mean, it was good. It's good to read that from her because of how she has that over 30 years of being bound in her wheelchair, and she actually didn't realize. She gives a lot of the biblical examples of Jesus, doing miraculous things to heal, paralytics, for instance, and heck, even making dead people come out of their grave, for that matter. I mean, Jesus obviously has the power to do anything at his own will,
Mm-hmm.
although he's not physically with us right now on earth. Um, I guess I guess that's metaphorically he's at the right hand of God at the moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, well, as far as physical healing, surely God can do that.
mhm,
But as far as a preacher, a theologian coming by and touch the fringe of his garment, I think that went out in the first century, and those were signs pointing to who Jesus is as the Messiah. Um, but now what we have is the Word of God, and somebody might say, well, that doesn't help me in my wheelchair, and and yet I would say to her, if I got in this conversation, I said, well, would you have written that book if you weren't in that wheelchair, right? So,
mm,
and how much more help are you giving to people by writing that book and sharing your story, versus if God did heal you, and I guess you could write a book on that too.
mhm.
So, yeah.
Well, it's funny. Just the other day, I found a guy on Instagram, and I'm trying to remember his name. I don't know if you've heard of him before. He was apparently, I think he's is it apologetics? How do you say that? What is the term for that person?
Mm-hmm.
A person that does apologetics?
An apologist.
Apologist.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Unapologetics. What do you do? I apologize.
Mhm.
Oh, I'm trying to remember his name. Of course, I don't have it when I need it. He gave anyway. He was paralyzed due to, I think, a sickness when he was maybe a preteen, and I think he was paralyzed for. Oh my goodness, I don't even remember what he said. He's got a story on his Instagram, and offline I'll try to remember his name and maybe send it to you. But he was able to through prayer and through a miracle, the paralysis went away, and then he eventually became a track star and has walked ever since then.
Oh, wow.
So it's amazing to think of the miracles that God can do and does do, and
Mhm.
now and he talks about a story, but anyway, we kind of got off track on that, but that's
Mhm.
you know just more, I guess, fodder you could say for reading the Word and understanding God's wisdom.
Mhm. Mhm.
We won't get too much into the Song of Psalms, but if you want to talk about, oh, I'm sorry, we skipped Ecclesiastes. Tell us a little bit about
Yeah.
Ecclesiastes, if you will, Dr. Joe.
Yeah. Well, Ecclesiastes, I think you could really sum it up in the second verse there, in the first chapter. Vanities of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity, vanity, all is vanity. So, um, meaning that apart from God, how do you make sense of this world?
Mm,
Um, you can only go so far, and you're going to end up banging your hand against the wall, trying to figure out why do things happen. Why do like we've talked about tragedies. Why does a person get paralyzed? Why does a baby die? And these and apart from God, you won't find that answer. And in some sense, that's what Ecclesiastes is saying. You got the third chapter there with the famous birds song of the Birds, an old 60s band
hmm
that you probably know, Gene, right?
Oh yes,
The Birds,
the
uh,
birds. Yes.
David Crosby, and
hmm
them, where it's everything there is a season. Turn,
Yep.
turn. Right. So that's the third chapter. a time to be born and a time to die. So it's very upfront book, truthful book, and I quote it. I quote it pretty much after every election season. Ecclesiastes 12:13, the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. So, and I say that because whoever is elected, we have to go on and fear God and keep his commandments, no matter what happens. So,
yep.
Good way
And no, I agree. Ecclesiastes definitely, they're all worthy reads, of course.
Yeah.
But and briefly, what is Song of Songs about?
Well, Song of Songs or Song of Solomon is basically Solomon's love letter to his wife, and his wife's love letter to him. It's yes, talking about marriage and sex, and that those are good things, which in the Christian church, in some places, when you say the word sex, it's like, oh no, and for good reason, apart from marriage, you would say, oh no, but within marriage, it's a good thing, a blessing, a gift of God. So, a lot of it is about that. And then in some sense, ultimately, it's about Christ and the church, where Christ is described as our husband, and the church as his wife. And I heard a great thing today. I think it's by R.C. Sproul, where Adam and Eve, are husband and wife, and when Adam sins, he blames his wife. Right? It was the woman you gave me. It was her. When we sin, the wife, the church, Jesus says, I'll take the blame. So I guess you can kind of sum Song of Solomon like that.
Yeah. Well, that pretty much wraps up what we talked about the Old Testament. We could you could do podcasts on every single book basically, but maybe maybe some do over time. But
you'd have to probably do it faster than a year.
66 books of the Bible, 66 years.
Yeah, it would be here for a long time.
Oh man, life happens, doesn't it? And you just get so busy. Okay, briefly before we go, the period. What was the last book that was historically written of the Old Testament that we know of? Do you know?
So that would be Second Chronicles. That's written about 400 BC.
Okay.
Yeah.
400 years before Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Wow. So all right. So 400 years before, roughly, the New Testament was, I guess, written probably, it was 60 plus years after Christ had passed or gone to heaven.
Well, it started to be written, I would say, in the 40s.
Okay.
So
not long after.
I would say you could make the case maybe 15 years.
Oh, 15, I was way off. Okay.
15 to 20 years. And then, it concludes about 60 years after. Mm-hmm. So about that time period from the 40s AD to about 96 AD or so.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Now, we'll worry about that when we talk about New Testament, but yeah, that period of time from when he went to heaven to when the first things were written, I kind of wonder what happened during that period. But anyway.
Yeah, that's true. Well, the church was being established. We can really see that in Acts. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so after Second Chronicles happens, what happens? Like, okay. Do you know? Do Jewish people recognize Second Chronicles? Is that part of their canon? or do they even
well,
care about it?
it depends on which Jewish people you
No,
ask. I mean, you know,
your
some
average Israelite, I don't know.
yeah, person living in Israel probably not. That's probably not where they go. They usually just stick to the Torah. Um, you know, if you read something from Isaiah, they wouldn't really see it. I mean, they would see that as, you know, scripture, I suppose, but it's
Mhm.
not where they would go, not what they would hear at the temple and or you know what they call temple. Yeah.
Okay, I guess I was just curious how did all these other verses outside of the Pentateuch or the Torah, survive? Was it through just did the Jewish people just keep those scrolls or whatnot?
Oh yeah, yeah. They would keep that in the synagogues.
Hmm.
Yeah, in the temple,
But
surely.
okay.
Yeah, but they, you know, how the New Testament used it and how the Christian churches used it has kind of taken over. And I would have to probably ask a Jewish person that
Yeah.
why does the Torah stick and Isaiah doesn't? But yeah, they would have those in the scrolls. You know, we can read that in Luke chapter 4, for instance,
Hmm.
where Jesus gets up and he reads the scroll and from Isaiah 61, I think.
Okay.
So yeah, that would be, they would all be there. Yeah.
That's interesting to me because I mean I just assumed that you know I don't know where like I just assumed that Jewish like let's just pull a name out or like Jewish people in Russia in the year 800 AD were they reading in the synagogue the book of Jonah and Micah and that sort of thing,
I don't know.
Good question for a historian, I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Mhm.
Okay, but I was gonna say for that 400 years between Old and New Testament, what was happening? What was going on that led up to Jesus?
Yeah, I mean, we can kind of call that the silent period where God does not speak to his people, but it wasn't that God wasn't active, though. I mean, we get
Hmm.
things like the Feast of Dedication, where, you know, Hanukkah comes out of, and off the top of my head, I can't remember all the battles that took place to bring that about, but that's around about 100 years before Christ that happens. I mean, and
Hmm.
other stuff was happening in the world, you know, like Alexander the Great and you know, the Greek philosophy and all that was going on.
Roman Empire was being established.
Roman Empire being established. You know, and then you got you know, the Maccabees. So you have books that were written, but they weren't scripture, right? So
Hmm.
they were mostly just like historical documents, basically,
Hmm.
where, you know, just like any other historical document, you know, you read about George Washington or whatever, and that's not
Hmm.
scripture. It's just, and, you know, was God doing something? Yes, he was, but he wasn't speaking through a prophet. Where, you know, then that intertestamental period ends, I believe, when John the Baptist comes on the scene,
Hmm.
and he's the final. You know, you can make the case that he's the final Old Testament prophet because he comes right before Christ and baptized Christ, and that's it for him. I mean, essentially,
Hmm.
that's his. He did what he was came to do. Yeah.
I think it'd be fun to have maybe if I could find a biblical scholar, maybe the historical perspective on the period, the 400-year period. I think it would be good to get historical context. I mean, you can read a book, obviously, but historical context on that is very interesting to me.
Yeah. Well, and the people were waiting surely for the Messiah. You know, And I think they would go back to the Psalms and they say, you know, how long, O Lord? Kind of like we're waiting now, you know, but it was 400 years for them and it's 2,000 years for us. Although I guess you can make the case it was also 2,000 years for them. But you know, it's definitely a hard time for God's people then because you know, the temple had been overtaken, and by that time by the Romans, and the Romans let them back in, but it just wasn't the same. And then that's why Jesus, you know, was talking all about, I am the temple. You know, they try to rebuild the temple, and he says, no, I am.
Yeah.
You know, I am the king. You don't need to go back. You don't need the king. I am the king. I am greater than Moses. You know, those all things were all those shadows pointing to me. So, yeah.
Well, I think that's interesting because not having an education on Jewish society of the time period of Jesus, you know, put you at a disadvantage in understanding some of the context, I guess. And the more you, I mean, just going, if you go to enough sermons, you'll get a good education on what Pharisees and Sadducees were like and what the society was like. But it's, you know, having that knowledge and understanding all dates back to the Old Testament, what we've been talking about in our different parts of this. And so I think that's a good reason to go back and read the Old Testament, because you're going to get that much more context. Because when you look at the New Testament, everything you read in the New Testament, you know, I heard somebody, you've probably heard of this, heard somebody say that they were a red letter Christian, a red letter Bible Christian, like as in they only believed in the stuff that was written in red letters that Jesus wrote. And I thought to myself, my first thought was, have you read what Jesus said? Because he preached on the Old Testament in the synagogues. He was
right.
He quotes the Old Testament numerous times.
Yeah. Well, and
Interesting.
it's interesting that there's even a red letter. It's like actually all the words of the Bible are Jesus's words. You can make
big touche there, right?
And that's what Jesus says himself. So just thinking about that a little bit more about the intertestamental period that popped in my mind, you know, Josephus, the Jewish historian, that's a good place to start. You know, he writes basically on antiquity, leading up to the New Testament period. You know, he's not a Christian himself. He was a Jew, but he also mentions Jesus in his writings and all the wars that take place. So I would say that would be a good place to start if you want like a biblical worldview sort of literature for that. You know, I mean, you could say what was going on in between and read all about Alexander the Great. You could pick up some things as far as the Bible there, but not as much as Josephus.
Yeah, that's interesting. All right, Joe. Well, we'll wrap it up. If you have any other thing you want to talk about, or if not, we'll wrap it up, and hopefully we'll do another part and start jumping into the New Testament.
Sure.
In less than a year.
Yeah, that sounds good. I enjoyed it. Thanks, Gene.
Well, I'm glad we've explored the Old Testament as long as it took us. And I don't know if we probably gained and lost subscribers left and right too. Either way, thanks, Joe, and we'll see y'all next time. Appreciate it very much.